All right. Thank you, everyone who is watching us online. We are starting exactly at 4 p.m. by Kiev, and I hope that we will get more viewers soon. We are broadcasting from Ukraine. My name is Timothy Brik. I'm assistant professor at Kyiv School of Economics. This is a series of lectures with top intellectuals, scholars, diplomats, military experts, security experts, and social science experts who were very kind and generous to offer their lectures of solidarity to support Ukrainian scholars and Ukrainian students during this invasion. Unfortunately, this invasion and this war in general, it has been executed not only against civilians and military, but also against science and knowledge in general. Our university campuses were bombed already. The headquarters of the Sociological Association of Ukraine is destroyed. So a lot of scholars are displaced right now. And nevertheless, we would like to show that Ukrainian academia is resilient, that we stand strong together with our army, with our nation, with our students. And we are very grateful to all scholars who have accepted our invitation to give a lecture. So I don't have words to describe how grateful we are. And today we have a very special guest. He was one of the first speakers who responded to our call, and it was very great to hear his response. Professor Sander van der Linden. He works at Cambridge, and I'm sure that many of you know him. He's a director of the Cambridge Social Decision-Making Lab. He has been a frequent guest of many popular media, podcasts, and web pages. He is an expert in the subject of communication, misinformation, mass mobilization, and today he will be talking about these subjects, perhaps touching the Ukrainian invasion as well. He will be talking for, I don't know, about 30-40 minutes, and then I will moderate a Q&A session with you. And you can watch us right now here on Zoom through our Facebook page and our YouTube channel. And later we will post this video on our social media as well, so you can enjoy our conversation when you have more time. I also must say it that if you watch us in Ukraine and you hear any alarms about airstrikes, please proceed to your shelter. Your security is priority here. So thank you, everyone. And Sander, this virtual floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much for the very generous introduction. Yeah, absolutely my pleasure to be here and talk about the subject of misinformation. Clearly, very, very relevant topic during this difficult time. What I hope to do is give you all a sense of some of the research that we have been doing to try to protect or inoculate people against disinformation. Some of that research is very general, but I've tried to pull out some examples to illustrate potential relevance to the Ukraine and the conflict, the Ukrainian conflict that's happening at the moment. Now, I won't spend a lot of time on defining what I mean by fake news and misinformation. I think, generally, we sort of define misinformation as any information that's false or incorrect, including simple errors. Whereas disinformation is misinformation coupled with some psychological intention to actually deceive or harm other people through deception. And then, of course, propaganda is disinformation with a political agenda. Now, at least, sometimes we use these words interchangeably, but I'm particularly concerned, and of course, especially during the conflict, we're concerned about disinformation and propaganda in particular, more so than misinformation, which could just be, an honest error or something like that. And so I'm particularly talking about disinformation during this talk. I don't have to show you examples of fake news about the conflict, of course, but this is one of the stories that I came across in my WhatsApp groups and also online. A story that a huge military convoy was heading to Ukraine. Now, this video was actually taken in Southern California, and so there's been a trend, as you probably well know, of fake and doctored videos. This was a video that went viral of claiming that Russian soldiers were preparing nukes, which was completely fake news. And of course, Putin's claim that the Ukrainian government is pro-Nazi and that he's on a peace mission was obviously false pretext for the invasion, and it leverages very quite complicated sentiments. And so a lot of misinformation tends to tap into narratives that people feel very emotional about. And what I've noticed is not only have we seen an influx of a very particular kind of misinformation. So as I'll show you later on, we tend to segment manipulation according to various techniques that are used to dupe people in the production of misinformation. But particularly during this conflict, what we've seen is a lot of the same kind of misinformation, particularly what are called shallow fakes, which are videos that are presented out of context. And so, there's war game videos being repurposed to portray that it's the Ukrainian conflict that's happening right now, or that there's soldiers in Ukraine that are being depicted in those videos, or Russian soldiers. We've seen footage from Gaza and other conflicts that happened years ago being repurposed. And what's so interesting is that these shallow fakes are really poorly done in a way. Because fact checkers can actually find out, by looking at the codes on the tanks or the weapons or the background or the metadata on the videos, they can quite easily uncover that these are false stories. And so actually, I don't think the purpose the purpose of Russian disinformation in this context is to convince people that what they're seeing in these videos is true. I think it's a strategy to try to bombard and distract fact checkers and analysts so that they're not paying attention to some of the other things that are going on. I think the disinformation strategy here very much is to flood the information space with cheap fake content to keep people busy. Now, if you look at the standard response, both in research as well as in practice, to misinformation, it's fact checking and verification, and of course is a very important element of news reporting. But when we look at the psychology of how well this works, there are some downsides to trying to correct misinformation after people have already been exposed to it. And one of the reasons for that, there's various reasons, but one of the reasons for that is what we call the continued influence of misinformation. So here are some meta-analyses of the efficacy of fact-checking across domains in different contexts. And typically what they found is that, yes, fact-checking is helpful, but it doesn't eliminate misinformation in full from people's memory. And that's because people continue to rely on misinformation. They continue to retrieve it from memory, even when they acknowledge a correction or having seen a correction about a particular claim. Now, there's various explanations, various neural explanations for why that's the case. Some have to do with the fact that people fail to integrate the correction with the misinformation. And so, once you see a correction, you have to tag information in your brain as false, and then you have to integrate the correction as part of the mental model, and somehow there's a problem with the integration. Other accounts are about retrieval, and so there can be a problem in retrieving the correction appropriately from memory. And so there are all sorts of things that go wrong when people have to delete what they've been exposed to before and memorize new information that's supposed to be correct. And so there are a lot of cognitive challenges that are going on there. But also practically, fact checking just doesn't scale to the same extent that misinformation does. If you look at some historical examples, the tobacco industry has been misleading people on the issue of smoking and cancer and disease for decades. And they were issued by the Supreme Court to run corrections and basically tell people that on the cigarette packages that they had been misleading people in the United States. Only 40% of smokers, estimates show only 40% of smokers are thought to have even seen the corrections. And so the amount of people that see a correction is tiny compared to the power of misinformation. So our research is very much focused on trying to flip the whole process on its head. Instead of trying to debunk after people have been exposed, we want to preemptively protect people by prebunking misinformation. And this idea of prebunking can take various forms. Pre just meaning, pre-exposure, but one particularly influential framework is called psychological inoculation, and I'll explain that to you in a second. I just want to show that there was an article in The Economist entitled Deploying Reality Against Putin. And it really talks about what I would refer to as a massive application of the idea of prebunking. So what the article is about the US decision to release intelligence that they had, which usually governments sit on and don't share with other people. But in this case, they decided to share the intelligence to try to prebunk the invasion. And you can see here in the article, this refers to the US government, applied the same tactic to its communications as they do to their intelligence. It released details of a supposed Russian plot to topple Ukraine's government, and another to create a pretext for invading eastern Ukraine by means of a very graphic propaganda video of fake attacks by Ukrainian troops, which would include corpses and actors and so on. And so they broadcasted this to NATO and the world prior to the invasion to prepare people for these shallow fakes that we're now seeing on a daily basis. And so I think this was very much the right strategy. This is a great example of pre-bunking. Now, it's said that this helped avoid polarization of NATO, of the American public's opinion on the conflict, and may have even delayed Putin's actual invasion by a few days or a few weeks. I mean, I don't know if that's true. I mean, there's some U.S. intelligence sources that appear to claim that, but I do think that there's value in this approach. So how does it work on a more scientific level? The inoculation theory follows the medical process exactly. It originated from Bill McGuire during another conflict. In fact, the North Korean or the Korean War. And during the Korean War, 19 American and 1 British soldier were captured and quote unquote brainwashed by foreign troops. At the time, there was a lot of talk about so-called Chinese brainwashing, which now we know was not exactly accurate, of course, but at the time, the government was very concerned about the fact that during the war, 20 American soldiers decided to stay behind in communist China voluntarily because they had been persuaded by what the Americans refer to as communist propaganda. Now, in reality, there were all sorts of other things going on, and reports from those soldiers, post-war were claiming other things. For example, some of the soldiers who were African American noted that the United States had racial problems and they didn't want to go back home. And I think it was a complex situation, obviously, but for the purpose of what they thought was true at the time, McGuire was inspired to think of the idea of how you could prevent people from getting brainwashed. And he did some preliminary work that was very important in psychology, but then it kind of disappeared. And so after the 60s, it disappeared. And so what we've tried to do is bring this research back into the 21st century. So what is inoculation theory? Inoculation theory is the idea that just as you inject people with a weakened dose or an inactivated dose of a virus to trigger the production of antibodies to help confer resistance against future infection, you can do the exact same with information. By preemptively injecting people with a severely weakened dose of the types of misinformation that they might see in the future, and preemptively refuting that information, you can build up cognitive or intellectual resistance. And this psychological process includes a warning that people might be manipulated in the future. So that helps kickstart the psychological immune system, so people are paying attention. And it has a more cognitive basis, which is technically called the reputational preemption. So you preemptively refute a claim that you are going to be exposed to in the future. We've relabeled that prebunking because it's easier to understand, prebunk versus debunk. Now, we started doing this work in the lab on specific issues. So for example, on the issue of climate change, there have been historic disinformation campaigns trying to cast doubt on the consensus that humans are causing climate change. This is orchestrated and very well documented. And in a number of experiments, we've shown that you can preemptively warn and inoculate people against those types of misinformation attacks. In advance, you tell people, there's other actors trying to mislead you, and you might come across, a petition that says that lots of scientists disagree on climate change, but you should know that people who signed this so-called petition include the Spice Girls and Charles Darwin, and all of the signatories are fake, or at least they cannot be verified. And fact checkers have rated this as false, and so on. And so then at the end, when people are exposed to the actual websites, they've been inoculated. I'm not going into this experiment right now because we have limited time, and I want to show you some of our real-world interventions rather than the lab studies. But the media kind of described this as a vaccine against fake news. I mean, I like immunization because vaccine implies you have full immunity, which that's not the case. So in these experiments, we were able to protect people by, maybe 33% or 60 up to 66% of the effect that facts alone would have on people. So, it's some protective effect, but certainly not, the type of immunity that a biological vaccine would confer. But there are a number of detailed review articles for people who are really interested in this. You can look at some of our reviews papers that summarize all of these individual studies, including some work in PNAS, and a report we recently wrote for NATO, where military personnel and intelligence officers can think about the theory of inoculation and how to leverage this in practice. Okay, now the lab is one thing, and so after we've done all of these lab studies, we realized that we have to get out into the world and actually test this. And we took some inspiration from the Harry Potter character, Professor Severus Snape, who was the Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher, who said, your defenses must be as flexible and inventive as the arts that you seek to undo. I think, as we're all aware, the dark arts of disinformation and manipulation are evolving. And so our solutions need to evolve beyond fact-checking and media literacy too. And so that's why we came up with the game. The game is called Bad News, and it's slightly controversial in the sense that it allows people to step into the shoes of somebody who's trying to dupe you with disinformation. And the reason for that is that it follows the inoculation analogy in the sense that we want to trigger people's psychological immune system. And for that, you need to experience a bit of a jolt, right? It's a bit of an experience. And then we expose people to weakened doses of the underlying strategies that are used to spread misinformation. So you can pre-bunk specific claims. So for example, if a story comes out tomorrow, you can try to pre-bunk that specific claim. But at one point or another, you come into a scaling problem. You cannot, well, maybe you could, but it's hard to try to pre-bunk every single claim, just as it is too difficult to fact check every single claim. So what we did is we spent a few years kind of undercover, trying to find out what are the general techniques that are used to produce almost all misinformation. And we worked with a gaming company called Droch, and now they're called Bad News, and they were very instrumental in this process as well. And what we did was we identified 6 techniques that are crucial in spreading misinformation. And I'll run you through these techniques in a second. But the idea is that if you can inoculate people against a general technique, then when you show them lots of specific fake news stories that are quite different, maybe there should be some sort of broad spectrum immunity. At least that's what we were hoping. So here's Bad News. John Rosenbeek, who I should mention, designed the scenarios, worked closely with Bad News, manages our gaming programs and all of the games that we've developed. He's absolutely brilliant. I should add here, he speaks Ukrainian and Russian. In fact, wrote his PhD on some of the prior conflict, and so he's really knowledgeable on this subject. And I encourage, if anyone has questions, I would encourage them to get in touch with John Rosenbeek. So the Bad News game, I'll show you quickly how it works here. It's a disinformation simulator, and very much the idea was to try to simulate a social media feed so it's much more realistic, so that the research that we're doing is getting more realistic. Here, this was when Donald Trump was president. We impersonated Donald Trump. After long deliberation with my generals, I've decided to declare war on North Korea, hashtag Kim Jong-un. And so here you tweet this, and then the aim is to gain as many followers as possible while not losing any credibility. Most people fail to recognize that the Twitter handle is manipulated here. When we test people, they don't see that it's a fake account. And so this is part of what we call the impersonation badge. Impersonation includes things like this, but also fake experts, doctoring videos, and similar techniques. And so what we do here is that we allow people to step into the shoes of somebody who's trying to dupe other people and expose people to weakened doses of the experience and forewarning people of some of the dangers. And so it's very interactive. Other users respond to you. It's kind of like you're on social media, and you go through the levels. So you go through these different techniques. So here are the 6 techniques: polarizing people in society, pitting 2 groups against each other, impersonating people, including fake videos, fake authorities, fake experts, conspiracy theories, trolling people. We've all known about troll farms. Using emotions to get people outraged and fear to try to intimidate people, as well as discrediting, basically saying you're fake news. Now, you note that this is not a philosophy of misinformation as something as either true or false. What we want to do is help people calibrate how reliable something is using these 6 degrees of manipulation. So when you see content that makes use of these manipulation strategies, we hope that people downgrade the reliability of the content. So we're not trying to tell people what they need to believe or what's true or false, but we're helping people spot manipulation. Now, the scenarios in the games are fictional, but they're based on real events. So, Warren Buffett is a billionaire, was impersonated on Twitter. So you can see the Trump example comes from this. Somebody created an account of Warren Buffett. They had 200,000 followers within a day, and he was giving out fake investment advice. But people were duped. And so it's the same technique, but we adapted in the game under a different heading. And then we test people in the game. So we asked them how we're unreliable or reliable. They find a piece of content. This was during Game of Thrones a few years ago. This is Johnson Crude Oil trolling Leonardo DiCaprio about global warming. So we hope that people realize that this is a troll, and so they find it less reliable after playing. So the first paper we ever published on this was just when the game went live. It went viral organically. People liked playing it, and we got free data coming in. And so we had about 30,000 data points, so 15,000 paired data points. This is a simple pre-post within subject experiment. For real news, people find that highly reliable before and after playing, but the items that people were exposed to in the game that were fake, that make use of these manipulation strategies, people found them significantly less reliable after playing. And I should note that the examples people see in the testing environment are different from the ones they're exposed to in the game. And so here's the distributions. It didn't really matter if you were left-wing, right-wing, younger, older, lower, or higher educated. There were some marginal differences, but basically, people found fake content less reliable, and their real news score didn't really change much. So that was positive. But it wasn't a randomized study. And so one of the things we did with our student, Melissa, is conduct a randomized experiment. Melissa also asked the important question of whether these kinds of interventions boost people's confidence, because we know that if you're not very confident in what you believe, you're easily persuaded. So to help people resist manipulative persuasion attempts, we were also hoping to make people more confident. This time we had a randomized trial where we exposed people to Tetris for the same amount of time as a gamified control group. And in this study, good news about bad news, what we found So the y-axis is the average of about 18 fake headlines that people were asked to rate, 3 for each technique. There's 6 techniques in the game, so it's about 18 items, 3 for reliability purposes, but we can chat more about that. So in the control group, the average change is 0, whereas in the inoculation group, people found it significantly less reliable fake news. You can see the density distributions here. Going to the left means less reliable, but also people became more confident in their own truth discernment abilities. And so this was a positive finding as well. My student Raccoon decided to do another pre-registered randomized replication now, but adding a time element. So one of the important questions we got was like, okay, great, you can vaccinate people a little bit against misinformation, but how long does the effect last? You know, because if it lasts a few hours or a few days, you know, that's not great. I mean, I would think that it's still useful, but agreed, you know, it could be better. So again, people are asked to rate these sorts of items. And then we looked at the long-term effectiveness in this study. I'm not going to talk through every single experiment. There were 3, but they're always the same with a minor twist. So in our experiments, and this is true for all of our current studies that we run, people do a pretest of these 18 items. They get randomized to inoculation or control. Then they do another post-test of the same items. And then we started following up with people 1 week later, 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, 2 months later, all the way until the end of the testing period without further intervention. So we were just attacking people with misinformation. Sounds a bit nefarious, but we would expose people to misinformation and see if the effect would last. In the second experiment, everything was the same, but we cut out all of the intermediate engagement and just tested people at the end. In the third experiment, we changed the item. Some reviewers said maybe people are memorizing the items, and so we changed the items at the different testing points. So here's what you find. By the way, all of our data is on the Open Science Framework. If you want to use it or look at, all of our interventions are free and publicly available. So here, nothing's going on. At the post-test, time 1, here we see the treatment effect. On average, people find fake news less reliable. The density moves to the left, which means less reliable. And this effect stayed week after week after week until 2 months, about 2 months. And so, you know, we thought, no, well, this isn't plausible. You know, knowing the effects of psychological interventions, immunity for 2 months, that seems a bit high. So we did another experiment. And if you remember, what we did here was cut out the intermediate testing. So what we see is the same effect, but after 2 months, we see, hey, there's decay of the effect now. So people find fake news more reliable again. There's still a treatment effect between treatment and control, but now it's creeping back up. And so what we concluded from this actually is that if you regularly engage people with the test items, you can boost people's immunity, because they're probably retrieving the lessons again of what they've learned, right? They might be motivated again to defend themselves against misinformation. And so when people are continuously engaged with the task, their immunity stays intact. But when you don't contact people, there's probably a lot of interference from the outside world. People forget, and the effect disappears. Okay, so once we've gathered all of this evidence, we teamed up with the UK government, who helped translate this intervention to major languages around the world, 15, but now we have at least 20. We did a study in Sweden where we basically found the same results, nothing going on in the control groups, but people find fake news that makes use of these techniques less reliable. Same in Germany, Greece, and Poland. There was a bit more variation in Poland. There was a bit more heterogeneity in the effect. It was still significant, but we saw the most variation in Poland, actually. And hopefully, I'm trying to make this relevant now. We have a Ukrainian version. It's called Bad News Ukraine. If you want to play the game, you can play it at www.getbadnewsukraine.com. Unfortunately, I cannot read this. John can, but hopefully it's a good translation. Here you can see some of the test items also in Ukrainian. We have a Russian version as well. I believe this is one about the Bitcoin rate. This is the conspiracy technique, trying to invoke a conspiracy theory. And so I want to show you some data that I've just downloaded from the Ukrainian version of our game. And so far, it seems that we're seeing a similar effect as in all of the other interventions. This is the density distribution. The dots are the data. The line is the median, and the square is the mean. So what you see here, pre versus post, in our in-game interventions, it's always a simple pre-post design because we can leverage the game to gather data on a continuous basis. So this is the effect size, 0.36, which is not huge, but it's pretty much in line with our intervention effect size across different countries. So you see that people also in Ukraine find fake news less reliable after playing the game. Now, I should say that we've adopted the general bad news version, which is now played by millions of people around the world. So we get lots of data to focus on the conflict, to see if we can inoculate people against misinformation about the conflict specifically. So here's a real news item. US, UK, Europe, and Canada block SWIFT access for some Russian banks. This really happened. But the thing is, it's not that this is true, why people should rate this as reliable. It's the absence of any manipulation techniques. It's just cold presented facts without persuasion. That's why people should find it more reliable. Now, here's some of the fake news. Russia is targeting US biological weapon labs in Ukraine invasion. These are all fact check articles that appeared as fake during the conflict. Actor Steven Seagal spotted among Russian special forces in Ukraine, which total nonsense, of course. Ethnic Russians face genocide perpetrated by the Kiev regime, which is a common propaganda narrative that's been circulated. And so we want to see if we can inoculate people against this sort of disinformation. John Rosenbeek just downloaded the data. It's been on for a week now. We have about 400 data points in the last week. And here we see that there is an effect, but it's very small. So it's working, but very small. I think it has to do with the fact that the misinformation we're using now is directly from the conflict, and we're not checking if the manipulation techniques that people are trained on in the game are also used in these items. And so really what we're requiring now from people is that it generalizes to all sorts of fake news. And I think it's not completely unrealistic to expect that the effect is going to be lower the further the fake news is from what people are inoculated against, right? Because you can't inoculate people against everything. But it's still promising that there is something going on here, and so we're going to continue to investigate. One of the great things I find about the defense against the dark arts metaphor is that it's a living intervention. We can adapt it continuously, we can update it, we can improve it, and so the last 5 minutes I just want to spend on what else we've been up to. We created a special version called Go Viral for the pandemic. This was done with the World Health Organization, the United Nations, and the UK government. It's only 5 minutes. So bad news is about 15 to 20 minutes. It's a deep simulation. So this is about 5 minutes. It focuses on the 3 techniques most prevalent during the pandemic, which was the use of fake experts, conspiracy theories, and using emotions to get people riled up. The United Nations helped spread the word about the intervention. We did some videos for public health authorities. You can find it on the World Health Organization page 2 if you're interested. We just published a paper. So, example is very similar. Nobel laureate professor claims the virus is not natural. These type of tactics, and we test people, and we published a paper on this recently. If you're interested, we do randomized controlled trials and within game studies for all of our interventions. We did Harmony Square, which might be of interest with the Homeland Security Department in the United States during the 2020 election. A lot of the game here is focused on foreign interference in elections, including Russian disinformation, particularly trolling. And so Chris Krebs, who was fired by Trump after he fact-checked Trump too much about his election claims, kind of explains foreign influence in 5 steps using the pineapple pizza metaphor, which formed the basis of a lot of the scenario developments in the game. And the idea is you take an innocent issue, should you put pineapple on pizza, and then you start dividing people. You say, oh, the Italians, they don't like it, it's offensive to the Italians. And other people say, oh, I love putting pineapples on pizza. Then you buy lots of bots to amplify the debate, you blow it up, and you create divisions. And that's the sort of content we're focusing on in Harmony Square, where you have a live newscaster and the ratings fluctuate based on the disinformation that's ongoing about the candidates. And here are examples of how we test people. You know, we show them real Facebook posts of what happened during the election. You know, fathers don't deserve a day, end Father's Day. And this one was a Trump supporter got killed during a hunting accident, which was tragic. But then you see people posting, ooh, 1.5 less MAGA-billies in the world. At least they died supporting their beloved Second Amendment. So this is kind of a troll. This is kind of a a troll about gun rights in America, and you know, kind of how this person had it coming because of their beliefs, and very polarizing in the United States. And so again, we test people, and we find in a randomized Tetris versus Harmony Square, people find fake news less reliable, they're more confident, and they're less willing to share it on their social media posts. And here you have John Rosenbeek, again, who I should mention, who is instrumental with Cass Sunstein and others at the United Nations, talking about how we could implement these approaches. The last thing I'll say, and then I think we're at 35 minutes or so, is we're now working towards herd immunity, which really requires inoculating enough people. We know the effect size is not huge. We know that it decays over time. So how can we help create immunization in online communities to an extent that it confers enough protection so that misinformation no longer has a chance to spread? And for that, I think we really need to team up with the organizations that control the flow of information in society, including social media companies. So one of the initiatives that we work with through our partner Google Jigsaw, which is the research incubator of Google, we've started to do videos instead of games. So we also learned not everyone wants to play a game. So we started to do short videos, 1 minute, 2 minutes, 30 seconds, where we pre-bunk techniques that are particularly prevalent on YouTube. So the videos follow the same format. So there's a warning, you may be targeted with disinformation. Here's a weekend example of what, let's say, scapegoating a group looks like. And then we give people examples to help them spot it in the future, which is the microdose. Now, what we did most recently, this is not published yet, is we trialed these videos on YouTube for real. So we did, with Google, we did a massive campaign on YouTube where we showed this, our inoculation videos, which are very general, right? We explain certain techniques on YouTube that are very prevalent, which are a bit different from other types of platforms. So YouTube has this big problem around political gurus and luring people in with rhetorical strategies to get them thinking in more extremist terms. And some of these strategies include false dichotomies. You're either with Ukraine or Russia, for example, to try to create extremist thinking patterns, or incoherence, again, emotional language. And so what we try to do in 30 seconds is, using animated videos, explain these techniques, get people to recognize them so that they're inoculated. And what we did on YouTube is we launched an ad campaign. And so people were asked to view these videos in the ad space on YouTube, so that it's really on YouTube. Then they were tested in that environment. And so I'll show you some of the data. So we had about 1 million views on these videos, 30% of which were randomly selected to answer some survey questions. And here's an example of how it appeared on YouTube. So, people are either part of the solution or they're part of the problem. Because of the space limits on YouTube, we turn it into a multiple choice question. So this is an example of a false dichotomy. So that's the right answer here. And so it was not immediate. So people saw this ad within 24 hours of being exposed to the video. And so, we could only get 30% because budgetary restraints and not everyone participates in the ad. But here are some of the results. So this is from actual social media. So we had multiple items to make sure that there's no item effects of just having a single item. We had 3 items for 2 techniques that we tested: emotional manipulation and false dichotomies. The first one didn't work, as you can see here. The other 2 worked. There was an average effect. For false dichotomies, we saw bigger effects. All of them worked. So this is the average kind of meta effect of all of these videos, which was about a 5% boost in technique recognition. Now, you might say that's small, but on social media in the wild, that can be meaningful if YouTube can scale this across hundreds of millions of people. So one of the things YouTube can do is insert these videos in the ad space that are non-skippable so that everyone's exposed. And that's kind of what we're currently hoping to have discussions about. So what's this 5% boost? So I'm not showing you the base rates here. So for emotions, the control group was about 60% correct, 65% correct. And so 5% boost means that in our treatments, people were, the treatment group gave the correct answer about 70% of the time. False dichotomies was more difficult for people to recognize. So the base rate was about 30, 35%. And so the treatment group would be about 40% correct. So it's about a 5% boost. Smaller effect size than in the lab, but I think that's quite typical. If you want to know, I just published a review on why people are susceptible to misinformation, how it spreads online, and what interventions out there to immunize the public. Just came out for those who are interested. Thanks so much for your time. I hope this was useful in some way in countering disinformation. Let us know if our research lab can do anything to help. And thanks so much for your attention.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much for your lecture. Well, have to address this elephant in the room. You see my shower now because we moved to this location due to the airstrikes alarm. This is the
oh wow,
my semi shelter. Yes. But going back to your lecture, of course, thank you very much. It was a very profound one. I especially enjoyed. Well, I like to see your findings that you observe similar results being reproduced in different cultures and different societies, which means that this is clearly a universal phenomena, and you can actually design policies and you can think of how to organize networks and ties between people to actually prevent and to limit the effects of disinformation and misinformation. And so I think this is very, this brings some sense of optimism to the world we live in now. I see some questions in Q&A chat. I will read it for everyone, and then maybe I will ask some of my questions as well. So we have a question from Barbara Winkler, and the question is there any chance to get this very important information also to people in Russia, who by now mostly hear propaganda from many channels? Our world, or would this be a fool's errand without a chance reaching enough people to make a difference? Yeah, so can you just comment, do you believe that we can reach people in Russia and influence their worldviews if we address them and talk about disinformation with them?
Yeah, this is a very important point. It's certainly something that's been on our minds as well. We have a version of bad news that is in Russian, but the cultural adaptation is not to the Russian context, and so it's mostly for individuals who are bilingual or who want to see the Russian version in Ukraine, for example. But it's possible to adapt it to the Russian context and to try to inoculate local Russian citizens against disinformation. There are some obstacles. One is, our remit is research, and so obviously we'd have to get ethics approval to do a study. The other is practical, actually launching this in Russia and not being blocked. So for example, you can't access our interventions in China. And so, governments have prevented that, not just ours, but a lot of these type of interventions. And so there's a practical question. And it's complicated by the ongoing conflict. So intervening as in terms of research, it's difficult because doing research during an active conflict is not so easy. But it's definitely something that's on our minds, and that we're hoping to move into. So I think that just to be concrete, I think the lowest hanging fruit would be to have a version that's adapted to local Russian context, and that helps inoculate people against use of the larger strategies. Again, because then it's not that we tell Russians what they need to believe, but we equip them with the tools they need to discern propaganda techniques. Of course, the question is how effective that is going to be. In the comment, it said something about a fool's errand. It's a good question. I mean, to be honest, we wouldn't know either. There's some interesting research on what audiences in Russia are more likely to be susceptible to state propaganda, and so I suspect that it might be effective with some audiences, but not with others. It could. We don't know if it could backfire or not. So far, we've seen that these type of interventions, which are a bit more light and less prescriptive, tend to reduce reactance and resistance, because we're still allowing people to make up their own mind rather than fact checking them on the spot. Yeah, no, it's a great question, and if anyone wants to approach us with a plan on that, we're happy to discuss.
Yeah, well, there are more questions and I will read them, but first I'd like to ask a follow-up question just to stay on this subject a bit more. I understand that you are, as a researcher, you have your own projects and you try to give us comments, referring to your data and to what you know best. So I don't want you, to push you to speculate about something that you don't know about, yeah. But still, I'd like to ask kind of big picture question, because a lot of people now are debating one issue, and maybe your perspective can be just, helpful in this debate. So the debate is about whether it is reasonable to sanction Russian internet, just to block certain social platforms, because on the one hand, there is an argument that it is important to clear this space of mass communication from fake news and from state propaganda. So maybe if you cut Russians off from internet, they will be actually more free to express their to signal truth. On the other hand, there is an argument that perhaps by cutting them from internet, you prevent them from, organizing and from sending correct information to each other. So there is no simple answer to that, but maybe you can just, think about it and talk about pros and cons of sanctioning Russian internet and social media platforms.
Yeah, I think, as you said, it's a complex question. But I think that we do need a combination of measures. So I like to think of the situation as needing a multi-layered defense system, and so we need to pre-bunk when we can. When that's not possible, we need to real-time fact check, and when that's not possible, we need to debunk in the most effective way possible. And so when you have all these layers in place, these softer measures, then it's less likely that information is going to get through. And I see that Barbara just posted our debunking handbook in the chat, and that is one solution. But still, I think there's value in strategically taking down accounts that are spreading disinformation. That's what social media companies have been doing. They've been trying to be, not enough, but they've been trying to be quick in shutting down some strategic cells. For that, you need to know the landscape. Obviously, you need to be monitoring very closely, and then decide how to take down nefarious actors. But then they just jump platforms, right? Telegram has been a huge source of disinformation, and so then you get the risk of them jumping to other platforms. And so you need a coordinated response, I think, in order for that to be effective. I am hesitant about completely deplatforming and shutting down sanctioning. I think sanctioning is okay in terms of negative incentives and fines, but completely shutting down and deplatforming, I think, could be risky for the reasons that you mentioned, that if there's no space for communication, that could be bad in itself also. So I do see that as a significant risk. But I would say that significant sanctions and coordinated responses to at least neutralize some of these accounts is very important, in addition to the softer measures of trying to help people discern fact from fiction, especially in emergency situations like this. Normally we might say, okay, you can't legislate news and so on, and technology is not going to fix it because people will find a way around the technology. But in an emergency situation, I think we do need some of these stricter measures sometimes. And if anything, if you look at the psychology of things, I think sanctions signal to people appropriate norms of behavior. So I think that's a very important function of the sanctioning. I'm not sure if everyone's kind of thinking of this, but I think when sanctions are implemented, it kind of signals socially deviant behavior, and it reinforces what's appropriate. And so the stronger the sanctions get, the more people participate, the stronger the consensus. And so you can only try to resist building social consensus for a certain amount of time. At one point, you're going to need to make concessions because the pressure is getting too much. And so I think that strategy, some people say we're not going fast enough, we're not pushing hard enough, and I see that. But I do see value in that general strategy.
Yeah. As you said, it's a very complex question, and I think you considered all the important points here. I see that there is already a conversation in the chat. There was a person, Maria or Masha Rafalovich, and she asks about maybe some specific recommendations if some individuals they believe in fake news. So how can you talk with them? What should you do? I see that other people already posted a handbook of what can you do in these situations, but maybe you can just talk about it briefly for our audience who is listening to us.
I'm happy to summarize some of the key conclusions from those handbooks. So you have to I think it's good to read the situation. So inoculation is obviously Prebunking is most effective when people have not been quote unquote infected yet. It works also when people are still on the fence, so they've been exposed but not yet convinced. But what do you do when you talk to someone who's already highly convinced of the fake news, of the disinformation? So this is the most difficult scenario. Difficult because I think one, there's the greatest resistance from the individual to changing their beliefs. It's often highly political for them or highly emotional, so people are on the fence already. And so I think what we found is that in order to try to get people to change their minds, there are a few things you can do that I found useful. One is to not try to challenge people too directly. So saying you're stupid, your ideas are false, you need to change your mind, that's likely not going to work. It might backfire. People might become more convinced, they're going to become defensive and so on. So instead of, the other thing is arguing with people over specific details is not always effective of the claim. So here's something that we found is more effective, is try to expose the techniques that are used to dupe people. So when I talk to somebody who believes in a conspiracy theory, I sometimes say, okay, well, what do you think? Do you think it's possible that there are people out there who profit off of people believing in these ideas? Or do you think it's possible that the person who came up with this theory is trying to dupe other people? Or you ask people, where does the belief come from? Why are you so convinced? And so that is a technique to extract more information so that you can target your response more effectively in a non-defensive way. So you typically start out by asking, okay, so why do you believe that? Where have you heard that? Why do you feel so strongly about it? In a non-confrontational way, which gives you information to try to then tailor your response more effectively. And the most effective response is usually to cast doubt on the motivations of the people who are spreading the misinformation. So instead of challenging the misinformation directly, you cast doubt on the motivations of the ones who are spreading it. And so typically what we see is why people gain resistance to persuasion is because A, they've realized that they're vulnerable, and two, that there are people out there trying to manipulate them. Nobody wants to be manipulated, regardless of what side they're on. So that's typically what we've found to be quite helpful. So using that route. In terms of if you have to counter specific facts, in the debunking handbook, we explain that it's good to don't repeat the myth too often, don't engage with the myth, just explain why it's false just once. ideally bringing out the technique, the underlying technique, and then end with try to reinforce the facts. But the important thing is, if you tell somebody that something is false, they need an alternative explanation to replace it in memory. So when you tag something as false, that's not enough for people in order to stop using it in our reasoning. So when you tell people something is false, you need to have an alternative explanation that is true. And it's important that that alternative explanation is just as simple as the misinformation. You know, if I tell you something, oh, you read the story about Ukraine, that's not true. Let me give you a 30-minute history lesson. That's too complex for you. The misinformation is simple. Now you're offering something very complex and the swap doesn't happen, right? So your alternative explanation needs to be simple enough so people can swap it. And also, it needs to not conflict too much with people's identity. And this is the biggest challenge. You know, sometimes you just can't help that, but try to frame the alternative explanation in a way that doesn't directly challenge people's political worldview too much, because then people resist it. And so to the extent possible, those are my recommendations.
Oh, that's great. And it also speaks a lot to the experiences of many Ukrainians right now. You know, there have been these I even don't know how to describe them, crazy stories reported in media. And I know some of these people myself, and actually it happened with, my family as well. So there were direct conversations between Ukrainian and Russian relatives. And apparently Russian relatives denied, or they did not believe in what was happening with their own relatives here in Ukraine. So, you know, people report that we are being bombed, but our relatives on the other side tell us that this is not true. And this has actually happened with us as well, with my girlfriend's relatives.
Exactly. That's a great example. Exactly. So I've seen that in the news as well. It's very similar to conversations that I've seen during the pandemic with people's family that in another state or another country, they don't believe that the virus is real and so on. And so, which of course is not the same as the conflict, but it reflects a similar challenge. And I think that the best way to deal with it is to gently ask people, oh, where have you heard that? Do you think all information coming from that source is accurate? You know, can we talk about, maybe, are you open to an alternative perspective? And people have to realize that persuasion is a slow process. You're not going to convince people in 2 minutes. And so we have to take small steps, chipping away gently, consistently over time. I think that's the better way to achieve change.
Yeah, absolutely. I cannot agree more. And from, you know, our own experience, maybe I will comment more as a sociologist, because you have talked, you know, from the perspective of psychology and social psychologists, and you talked about cognitive and behavioral patterns. But you also mentioned something very, very important, which I absolutely agree about, which is the role of these organizations and fact-checking organizations and governments and platforms. So what we have experienced here in Ukraine is that it is absolutely necessary, even for us as individuals, to think about it in terms of long-term solutions and to build these organizations that will then help us. So when the war started like 7-8 years ago, after the annexation of Crimea and the occupation of Donetsk and Luhansk, so many Ukrainians invested in these fact-checking organizations. So we created my partners, my colleagues created the organization called Vox Ukraine. Our friends from Kyiv-Mohyla University created Stop Fake initiative. There was another initiative by Catholic University in Lviv, another by the Media Sapiens. And so there were so many different fact-checking organizations that actually addressed these false narratives, flagged them, and prepared these very simple booklets, about the information and how to talk about this in bullet points. So right now, quite a lot of Ukrainians can refer to this information, because when you meet, when you emerge in this new situation for the first time, when you talk to your relatives, and your relatives, they don't understand you and they don't believe you, a lot of people experience shock and they become very emotional and they don't know how to talk. However, if you have these handy booklets already prepared, and you can just refer to them, this helps a lot. And of course, all these organizations, they really, really contributed to facilitating this culture of how to read news, how to read the internet. So I see that a lot of Ukrainians, they have become much more conscious and aware about this risk of misinformation. And a lot of people, they question the source or they cross-check it with something. And this does not happen overnight. Yeah, it's very incremental. And I think this culture has developed quite recently due to this tremendous work of all these fact-checking organizations. Yeah, so it's there should be something about your own, discipline and behavior and training your cognitive skills, but you must be protected by organizations and institutions that should be somewhere on the background, helping you to deal with these things. So it's a very big picture thing, and I think other societies, they should learn these lessons from the Ukrainian example and prepare these organizations to be ready for the challenge of the 21st century of this global informational warfare. I would use this word.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's such an important point that you need to have the infrastructure ready, and the ability to give people the toolbox that they need in advance to have that infrastructure ready is such an important advantage. And you're absolutely right that you need the whole infrastructure, including some of the actors that dominate the space, social media companies. Unfortunately, they're not within our control, but we need coordinated responses and have them thinking proactively about what to do when these situations happen in the future. Because as you said, I think it's absolutely crucial to have the right institutions and infrastructures in place to deal with the growing information warfare.
Yeah. So I think we already talked for 1 hour. Zandra, please tell me, do you have time for one more question, or should I proceed?
No, I can do one more.
Okay. So I also wanted to ask, and again, this is more kind of big picture and speculation, but still you're an expert on many subjects, and maybe you can talk about and even speculate about it. So do you have any view, any perspective on the deepfakes challenge? Because on the one hand, I can imagine that those things which you presented, they can be universal. Maybe you as a person either know how to deal with fakes or you don't know. Maybe it's binary. And it doesn't matter if this is about faces or text or video or audio, you can detect misinformation and you don't follow it. Or maybe this is a spectrum. Yeah, maybe you can train yourself how to read text, but when encountering deepfakes with manipulation of faces and voices, maybe then you are not able to distinguish fake news from not fake news. Do you think that this challenge will have some additional complication to the story? Do you think we should study them separately? Or is this just a part of one big universal story?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's part of the story, but there's also some reason to single them out as an area of interest. So, when you talk to different people, not everyone's convinced that deepfakes are as concerning as a lot of policymakers are worried about. A lot of policy meetings for a number of years we heard, deepfakes, but it's an interesting challenge. So to us, I think in a way, it's just a more sophisticated form of what we call the impersonation technique. And so, we could update our interventions along those lines. But at the same time, as you said, it's a spectrum. It's not the case that people can just detect deepfakes and text and everything. It's not. There's a limit. And the tricky thing about deepfakes is that, unlike the shallow fakes that fact checkers are now deconstructing, relatively easily, deepfakes are much harder. And there are cues. There were in the beginning. There were cues like the hairline or the eyes and so on that you could help people train to spot a deepfake. Deepfakes then get more sophisticated, and then you need to use different cues and so on. And so I think at some point, we need to think about a more durable strategy to deal with deepfakes. I think we can get somewhere with helping people spot deepfakes, but I've certainly been thinking about other ways in which we could do it, and we've been talking to a computer scientist at the University of in Pennsylvania, if we could do something with a simulation that does something more for people in terms of how to recognize deepfakes. But yeah, so in a short story, I think they're just in a way just an advanced version of the manipulation technique, right? The virus evolves and they get more sophisticated, and so our response needs to get more sophisticated as well. But I think we need to do something different once we get to the stage where media is becoming increasingly synthetic, not just deepfakes, but people living in their own simulated online environments. Everything is getting more synthetic, and so I don't think we're quite there yet. Some people think that it's overhyped, but I do think that we're going towards take virtual reality, which is not a deepfake, but I do think that people are getting increasingly embroiled in not just new media environments, but simulated media environments, and deception can happen much faster there because our senses are tricked at a much deeper level, and that's also what's happening with the deepfake. And so I think we need a more innovative solution for that, and I don't have it yet, or at least we were thinking about it, but I don't think, other than helping people spot the characteristics of a deep fake, which we're currently doing, I think in the future we're going to need a different solution, and what that is isn't entirely clear to me yet.
Yeah, thank you. I think we can offer you an interesting case for your future presentation. There was, I don't remember, maybe it was a week ago or maybe 9 days ago, during some first days of the invasion, a lot of Ukrainian citizens received this message, and the message was circulating through Telegram and WhatsApp a lot. The message right from official sources, from our Ministry of Defense and from our administration of President. So basically, there was a strong statement that the Russian side is going to release a deep fake of the President Zelensky, saying that he's giving up, and so we should give up. And it was actually the case of Prebunking. Yes, so the government was getting ready, and the message was that if you see such messages, you should not trust them. Then nothing happened. Yeah, we did not see these deepfakes in the end, and perhaps we don't know. Maybe nothing actually was preparing. Maybe it was just some warfare. Maybe indeed it was a successful pre-bunking. We don't know, but nevertheless, it was widely spread and it was widely discussed among individuals and on mainstream media. And I think it made a lot of Ukrainians just aware about these risks. So and I think now a lot of Ukrainians are on high alert, and they.
So the Ukrainian government send out information about a possible deepfake about Zelensky to the people.
Exactly.
And yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, I think that's a great pre-bunk. And as you said, maybe it didn't end up. Maybe the attack didn't end up happening. But that's what I like about the pre-bunk, is that there's nothing wasted. You've still raised awareness about it for potential future purposes. Sometimes organizations I talk to do say, okay, but it takes resources and time, and we only want to pre-bunk if it's necessary. But to that extent, monitoring is useful. I think this would obviously be a case where it's worth doing, even if there's no attack, because the consequences could be very high. And maybe there's some situations where the pre-bunk, the trade-off is not worth it. But here, yeah, that's a great example.
Yeah, I will send you more about it in.
If you could send me something about it, it'd be super helpful for our research. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I don't see any more questions. There were some questions on Facebook. Basically, people were demanding or asking for your textbook with your advices about misinformation. People were also saying thank you through Facebook. And I will just say a few closing words. I feel obliged to plug in and to promote our donation campaign. The thing that Kyiv School of Economics has initiated this donation campaign using our own fundraising platform. We are registered in the US, which means that everything is legal and transparent, and you can send money to us from any part of the world in euro or dollars or even crypto. And if you work in the American organization, you can expend all the tax deductions according to the American law. And our main goal here is to raise donations for humanitarian aid to support Ukrainians and Ukrainian NGOs who need your support right now. So I just put it in our chat and Facebook chat as well. Thank you very much for watching us online, for being with us. Please follow our updates on our Twitter and our Facebook page. We will post more about these lectures. On Monday, next Monday, we will have Paul Krugman, who is an economist. He's a winner of Nobel Prize Award, and he will be talking about Ukrainian-Russian economy and the consequences of this invasion for global economy. So thank you very much for being with us. And Zander, thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate that you accepted our invitation. You were one of the first people to volunteer, and I think our Ukrainian scientific community, we appreciate it a lot. So thank you.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thank you so much. And yeah.
Thank you. Have a good day.